The musical Wicked premiered on Broadway back in 2003, and it has since become one of the most successful and highest grossing Broadway musicals of all time. In 2016, Universal Pictures announced that they are going to be doing a film adaptation of Wicked. It was originally set to release in 2019, but got pushed back due to COVID and then the strikes and other things involved. And we eventually got an announcement that it was going to be released in two parts, spaced out a year from each other. And we were getting the first installment, which was just simply called Wicked, in the last quarter of 2024. Wicked for Good, which it's now called, Part 2 or Act 2 of the Wicked musical that we're familiar with, is going to be coming out in the last quarter of this year in November of 2025. During all of my coverage this award season that just ended, one of the most frequently asked questions that I would receive in my comments or on my live streams is if I thought Wicked for Good could have just as good of a showing at the Academy Awards and in awards season in general as the original Wicked did just last month. I'm going to do a video for you now letting you know what I think could happen when it comes to Oscar nominations for Part 2 or For Good of Wicked, and I will also talk to you a little bit about my personal hopes for the sequel and what we can expect. Let's get into it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the garage. Gerald here with you, of course, and the subject of this video is Wicked. Not the musical necessarily, but the movie, the film adaptations from John M. Chu and distributed by Universal Pictures. Now, as I said, and I'm sure you're very well aware, the original Wicked, or Part 1, came out this past November and made a huge box office splash. As we're sitting here, it's made over $750 million at the box office worldwide. Now, at the same time that they filmed the movie that we've already gotten, they filmed Act 2, Part 2, or what is now being called Wicked for Good, which will be coming out this November and will complete the story that we're familiar with from the Broadway musical. I have been a huge champion of not only Wicked as a movie this award season, but more specifically for me personally, Ariana Grande, who portrays Glinda the Good in this version of Wicked. I had her as my #1 favorite supporting performance nomination this year. I also foolishly continued to predict her award show after award show until eventually I had to come to terms with the fact that nobody was going to be able to beat Zoe Saldana this year for her turn as Rita in another musical, Amelia Perez, as of course she went on to win the supporting actress Oscar and swept the entire season, winning every televised award in that category. Even though Ariana Grande was nominated with her at all of those award shows, she was unable to secure a prize this year. So people know that I loved Ariana and that I continue to laud her performance. I just thought she was the best among the bunch that got nominated this year by a mile. But because of that, a lot of people would come at me in my comments or on live streams and would want to know what I think about Wicked for Good's chances coming up this winter, and whether I think it can have just as many nominations as the original got, which by the way was 10 Oscar nominations, tied for the second most this year. And I hate to even admit that Amelia Perez got 13 nominations, as I am not a fan of that movie. If this is not the first time you've seen my channel, you probably know that. Now, Wicked is an Oscar-winning film, as it walked away with the Academy Award for costume design for Paul Tazwell. Well-deserved, easily the best costumed film of the year, at least among the nominees.
And the Oscar goes to Wicked Paul Tazwell.
And it also won production design, which is equally deserved, as has been noted in several behind-the-scenes videos, that these sets were very elaborate. They were built, the majority of them practically by hand, by crews, and they basically created this live-in world. But it did come up empty in all the top-of-the-line categories that it was nominated for, including Best Picture, as I mentioned, Best Supporting Actress, and Lead Actress, which of course Cynthia Erivo received a nomination for her portrayal of the lead character in Wicked, Elphaba.
And then she's spotted. She is noticed for her talent, which she has no control over. And I think for the first time she feels seen.
So a lot of people may think, myself included from time to time, that a movie coming along as a sequel or as a chapter in a series of films doesn't always perform really well at the Academy Awards. Not only that, Wicked and Wicked for Good are only spaced out a year apart in terms of release. And obviously the Academy Awards are going to be spaced out a year apart too, as I assume the 98th Oscars will be taking place next March of 2026. Now, what I've done on this video is I've done essentially a pros and cons list. And like I said, I'm trying to basically convince myself that Ariana Grande can be back in the discussion next year, and this time hopefully win a televised award and even maybe an Academy Award at the Oscars. And then of course, as an extension of that, what else is the movie going to be nominated for? Are they going to nominate it for costumes again, for production design again, cinematography, score? We know there's some original songs coming from Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo, so I can already tell you what my prediction for original song is next year. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in these pros and cons I'm going to go through as well. It's going to be some pros and cons, and it's going to be some neutral facts that honestly could pull one way or the other. And it really makes it kind of frustrating for me when I was doing this research, because I don't know the Academy's mindset in 2025-26 versus when musicals were the hot thing in Hollywood, which you'll see when I talk about some of the history involved here. At the bottom of the screen, I will put for you whether it's a pro or a con or both. If it has a plus and a minus symbol, then that means I don't really know what it is, and it's going to possibly be determined as we get closer and closer to the Academy Awards, depending on what the competition is and depending on what the Academy's mentality and their stance on certain topics that kind of line up with Wicked for Good here, which is kind of what I was saying before. So first up, which I would definitely list as a pro for Wicked for Good, is the Academy loves musicals. In fact, in their 97-year history, 45 films have been nominated for Best Picture that would be categorized as musicals. Over 50 have been nominated if you count music movies, which would be things like A Complete Unknown this past year, A Star is Born with Bradley Cooper, those types of films. But actual stage musicals or movie musicals like La La Land even, there's been 45 of those nominated for Best Picture, and that includes Wicked this past year. Here's some of the more notable ones I'll put on the screen for you, and I'll just read a few of them. Obviously, this year we had two with Wicked and Emilia Perez. Also movies like La La Land, Chicago, Moulin Rouge. And when you look back to the 1960s specifically, as you see on my list here, starting really in 1959 and going all the way through to 1969, there was at least one musical nominated every single year, with the exception of 1961 and 1964. Now, in recent years, it hasn't been as repetitive for the Academy in terms of their musicals nominations for Best Picture. As I just mentioned, we had two this year, but traditionally speaking, there was kind of a drop-off after the early 2000s. You had films like Moulin Rouge and Chicago, which ended up winning Best Picture in 2003, and then you didn't have anything for a decade until Les Miserables was nominated and was considered a bit of a return to form for the genre at the Academy Awards, or so we thought, and then it disappeared again for a while. You had a nomination for La La Land in 2017, and the mix-up where everybody thought it won Best Picture until we realized that the envelope had the wrong font on it, and it actually went to Moonlight.
La La Land.
This is not a joke. Moonlight has won Best Picture. Moonlight, Best Picture.
But I think the narrative has been created with the Academy that they are not shy to nominate a musical if it's something that they adore, and frankly, if it's something that's loved broadly across America and the world. And in that way, it could be measured by box office, which will be another point that I'll get to here in a second. But I think the fact that the Academy has a strong track record when it comes to giving musicals their due, that we could be in for another nomination for Wicked for Good, just like we got for the first one, because even though it's the same property, believe me, Act 2 is much more different thematically than Act 1. So it's frankly like they're going to be two different movies with the same characters in them. Now, this one you could put as a con if you chose to do so, just because of the rarity involved and because of the sparseness of the fact. But I'm going to put it as a pro because I think it's a pro because we have a precedent already. If Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo specifically didn't have this fact to hinge their chances on, then it would be a con. But the pro that I'm going to list here is 6 times in Oscars history, an actor or an actress has been nominated for playing the same role a second time. I'll just list them for you real quick. The most recent was Sylvester Stallone, who of course played Rocky in the original Rocky in 1976, and he reprised that role several times throughout the series and ended up getting nominated again for a supporting actor role when he played Rocky in 2015's Creed. Paul Newman brought a iconic Hollywood character to life, Fast Eddie, in 1961's The Hustler, and then reprised that role with Tom Cruise in the sequel, kind of the unofficial sequel, The Color of Money, and was nominated again in 1986 for the same role. Cate Blanchett is the only actress to do this, be nominated for playing the same character twice, but have a win for it. She played Queen Elizabeth 2 times, first in 1998's Elizabeth, and then reprising that character in 2007's The Golden Age. And then of course Al Pacino, who played Michael in Godfather and Godfather Part 2, receiving nominations for both, and that was just 2 years apart. Peter O'Toole played King Henry twice in the 1960s, first in a film called Beckett, and then later in a film called The Lion in Winter. And last but not least, the first actor to do it was Bing Crosby, as he played Father Chuck O'Malley in Going My Way back in 1944, and a very, very successful musical that got nominated in 1945, The Bells of St. Mary's. So it has not happened since 2015, when Sylvester Stallone received his second nomination for playing Rocky. But it has happened. That's my point. If Ariana Grande or Cynthia Erivo give a performance as equal or possibly even better than the performances they gave in the first film, I do not see why they could not receive an Oscar nomination all over again. And I already mentioned that it might actually be switching up different categories even. So if Ariana was nominated in supporting last year and she ends up being a lead in Wicked for Good, then she could get a lead actress nomination, or vice versa for Erivo. Now again, I know people could say that this is a con because it's only happened 6 times in 97 years, and I understand that, but to me it's more important that it has happened recently as 9 years ago. So my interpretation of it is to be hopeful and to be optimistic that the Academy will nominate these ladies if the performance stands on its own as good enough. Another kind of exception to the rule that I'm going to list as a pro here as well, because we have that precedent and we're not fighting against it and trying to create it if we're Wicked. In the history of the Academy Awards, 10 sequels have been nominated for Best Picture. 2 of them have won, but it's been nominated 10 times if you were a sequel. Here are those films on the screen. Avatar, of course, Dune Part 2 just this past year, The Godfather twice with Part 2 and Part 3. And then you had some kind of interesting outliers in there like Toy Story 3, which was the last major animated film to receive a Best Picture nomination. And of course, Lord of the Rings twice. And The Return of the King is one of the wins for Best Picture, the other one being Godfather Part 2 back in 1974. Now, I think a con, kind of a caveat to this pro that I'm listing, is that it's only 1 year apart for Wicked for Good. So it's going to be extremely fresh in the Academy's mind because they just got done voting, and it's going to come up to the next time. Some of these folks might not even watch movies until the Academy portal is open, and then they try to cram them all like they're studying for an exam. If that's the case, they might be like, I just saw Wicked. Why am I watching it again? I hope that's not the case, but that could be a con in this scenario, because a lot of these other films, with the exception of the Godfather films, were spaced out by quite a few years. The only one that had a gap as close as the 2 Wicked films would be Lord of the Rings. And that can also be seen as a pro because, of course, Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, ended up racking up at the 2003 Oscars, winning a lot of stuff, including Best Picture. So that's a scenario where, and people use that example frequently when they're talking about sequels and the Dune films, about how the Academy was waiting until the last installment to then award the series, if you will, reward the work cumulatively over the chapters in the film franchise. And if that is true, which I don't necessarily know that it is, because The Lord of the Rings, in my opinion, is the only real example of it happening. But if there is some truth to that, then Wicked for Good would be the benefactor of that, because there's not going to be another one. Act 2 is the end of the musical. So unless John M. Chu or Universal decides to continue the story along based on the Maguire books, which the second book is called Son of a Witch, then we're not going to see any more of these. So again, this is one, depending on if your glass is half full or if your glass is half empty, you could decide whether this is a pro or a con. I choose to say that it's a pro with a little parentheses possible con. I want to talk a little bit about box office here. Of the 10 nominees this past Oscar season, Wicked was the highest grossing film of the 10 to receive a Best Picture nomination. It was very, very close for Dune Part 2, but it did outperform at the box office by about $25 million. In the last 35 years, 4 films have gone on to win Best Picture that were also the highest grossing film in the category that year. Those films would be Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, Titanic, Forrest Gump, and Rain Man, which that one actually kind of surprised me. Now, movies that made over $1 billion at the box office, which would be considered a blockbuster and among the highest grossing films of all time, only 9 of the 53 movies that would fall into that category have ended up going on to be nominated for Best Picture. Now, that's only about a 5% return, so that's not good. But we can be hopeful because, again, we're not attempting to be the first one to do it. And I'm talking about from the standpoint of the Wicked production. It's been done before, even though it was only 9 out of 53 times. Now, only 2 of those ended up winning, and that, of course, was Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, and Titanic from James Cameron. What I think Wicked has going for it in terms of this pro / possible con, but I'm going to say pro, is that it's going to be the probably most well-known nomination among the bunch, I would imagine. There's no huge blockbuster films on the horizon this year, at least that I can think of, that would also be Oscar worthy. You think of like James Gunn's Superman is probably going to make a crap ton of money. There's going to be films that are going to outperform Wicked at the box office, but I don't know that any of them, aside from Wicked for Good, would be included in that Best Picture discussion also. So you look at a movie like Barbie 2 years ago, you look at Oppenheimer, obviously that same year, and then even this past year with Dune Part 2 and Wicked Part 1, these are films that everybody went to see. The box office would speak to that, and there's some nominations that come along with that, of course. And the Academy long lists these films and wants to recognize films that everybody's going to know. Not everybody's going to know Anora, even though that ended up winning Best Picture. Now people are seeing it. But prior to the Academy Awards, I have friends of mine that like movies that didn't even know what the hell that was. Whereas if you go to any city in America right now and you ask them if they've heard of Wicked the musical, I would say 9 out of every 10 people you talk to are going to say yes. So I think the notoriety and the potential box office success that I feel like it's going to have, especially based on the success of Part 1, could aid it in getting, at a minimum, another Best Picture nomination. But I think when you're nominated for Best Picture, other categories tend to fall into place. Very few films get nominated for just Best Picture. In fact, I think that's only happened once in the history of the Academy Awards. I didn't fact check that, but I think it happened once back in the 1940s. Now I'm going to give you a couple cons because I feel like that's only fair. However, I will recognize that even though I'm listing this as possible cons, the Academy could surprise me. In fact, point of note, this year, or this past year at the Academy Awards, the Academy nominated a body horror film called The Substance multiple times, and in all of the top of the line categories for the most part, including lead actress, of course, for Demi Moore, Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Original Screenplay. That is not a traditional Oscar-friendly film, but they did it. They surprised me. So I want to give you that little caveat because even though I'm listing this as a con, maybe they love it and it doesn't end up hurting the film. And that's kind of what I'm hoping. The con that I'm going to list here is that Act 2 of the musical that I've seen on stage and that you can find synopses of basically anywhere right now is much darker than what we got with Wicked Part 1. It is a much more grim, bleak, and frankly a little soap opera-y, is that a word? And dramatic than what we got in the first movie, which was essentially a fun musical of this friendship kind of blossoming. Started as kind of animosity and then blossomed into a friendship with some very striking songs, popular, and of course Defying Gravity, which is the finale of Act 1. But when you get into Act 2 of the film, by the way, I want to put a minor spoiler alert on this video. For the next couple of minutes as I'm talking about Act 2 of the musical, if that ends up being translated to screen, then that could spoil Wicked for Good for you. So this is your spoiler alert. There's timestamps down below. If you want to skip ahead to the next jump in the chapter so that you're not spoiled, please do so now. But in Act 2 of the film, which essentially I think will be the general outline of For Good when it comes out, there are very little heroes in Act 2. It is a very villain-centric story. There's a lot of unsavory characters, and even the characters that we know very well from the first act kind of have a heel turn in the second act. Whether you're talking about Nessa Rose after she takes over Munchkinland, whether you're even talking about Glinda the Good, or of course Madame Morrible, who in Act 2 of the film, basically because she can control the weather, she created the tornado that eventually brought Dorothy to Oz in The Wizard of Oz, which of course ends up killing, and hopefully you listen to my spoiler alert, this is another shot, another chance, basically ends up killing Nessa Rose, or who was being referred to as the Wicked Witch of the East at the time the house fell on her. Now this spirals into a situation where Elphaba, as Nessa Rose's protective sister, blames Glinda for the death. We also get a lot of, like I said, soap opera kind of storylines with the wizard, which in the film is Jeff Goldblum, and how he connects to Elphaba. And I've already done a spoiler alert, but I won't say it. But anyway, it's very like General Hospital Days of Our Lives in the second act of Wicked. And we also get the origin for some of our known characters. And even though I gave you a spoiler alert, I'll stay away from a couple of facts. You can find them if you want to. But a couple of our characters that are prominent throughout the story, we get to see the origin for some Wizard of Oz characters that had not popped up yet at that point, such as the Tin Man, of course the Scarecrow, and eventually the Cowardly Lion as well. Now, with all that being said, if this film is less PG, less fun, and less family friendly, if you will, than the first Wicked was, which based on the subject matter, it really should be technically, but the tone can be set by John Chu, and depending on how the performances in the film and how his direction and the aesthetics of the film are relayed to the audience, then who knows what we will get, and maybe it actually won't be as dark as the subject matter would imply that it is. I mean, hell, if you're thinking of the Gregory Maguire book, which the musical was adapted from, in the book there's like orgies of animals mixing with humans and then murdering people. I mean, it's a very dark story that was translated to a palatable musical for kids. So it can happen where this can be a very digestible interpretation that is just as successful and fun as Act 1. And I'm hoping that that's the route we go, because if we go a little more literal based on what's happening in the narrative, then frankly, like I said, it's just a much more dramatic and dark, grim story that we get this time around. I know I didn't give you a lot of cons on this list, but I got one more pro that I want to mention. So we're getting 2 new original songs in Wicked for Good. And along with all of the songs that are going to be very well known from fans of the musical, we assume Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo are maybe each going to have a song, or maybe they're going to do a duet together and then the other one's going to have a song. I don't really know yet. It hasn't been announced yet, with the exception of knowing that we're getting 2 new songs. So that's a pro, because those are 100% going to be in the running for original song this year. Wicked got nominated for original score this past year, and honestly, I guess it made the rules of being an original score, but even that proved that the Academy just loves the music in this film and in the musical in general. And it's being performed by one of the world's biggest pop stars in Ariana Grande, and one of the more eclectic singers with the best range I've heard in a long time in Cynthia Erivo. Then of course they're going to be in the running for Best Original Song. In fact, if both of them don't get nominated next year, now of course I don't know what else is going to come out, but I frankly would be shocked as I'm sitting here, and I know at least one of them is going to be nominated and probably go on to win the award. So that's a pro, because once you're in there and you have a nomination, you're in the door. People are seeing your movie because you're nominated for whatever. You know, if you're nominated for original song, if you're nominated for cinematography, obviously if you have an acting performance nominated. If your film is Oscar nominated, the Academy members are going to watch your movie to vote in the category that you're nominated in. Now, of course, you want to be nominated in more categories across the board, because then more people are going to see it from various branches. Look, the success of Part 1 that we just had at the box office, yes. 88% currently on Rotten Tomatoes, generally loved by critics and audiences. I have friends of mine that are horror heads that love the sickest crap you would ever see, and it was their favorite non-horror film of the year. It is a very digestible, palatable, universal film that speaks to everyone, because it lends to the story of childhood innocence and calling back to the nostalgia of a staple of not only most people's childhood, regardless of what generation they're in, and I'm talking about great-great-grandparents even, up until today, The Wizard of Oz, which of course is one of Hollywood's pillars of cinematic success, which also was a Best Picture nominee at the 1940 Academy Awards, by the way, which is another one of those 45 musicals that received a Best Picture nomination. So how beautiful would it be to come around full circle since 1940 all the way to 2025 to get another win for Wicked? This time it would be for good. And hopefully Ariana Grande, Academy, if you're watching. What do you guys think? I came up with some pros and cons. I'm basically trying to convince myself that Ariana Grande is going to be back in the mix for an acting award next season, and I'm going to make it happen, at least in my mind. Let me know what you guys think. Are you fans of Wicked? Do you want to see Wicked get another slew of nominations just a year removed from this Academy Awards? Or do you think they got what they deserved and that's it and we're good? No pun intended. Let me know down below in the comments, and thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you subscribe for all kinds of award season coverage like this, including rankings, countdowns, and as we get closer and closer to next year's Oscars and award season, I will be doubling up on the content. And of course, I'll always be doing movie reviews and other types of things movie related for you here on the channel. I will see you guys next time out here in the garage.